He thought he'd buried the past beneath the red soil of Arizona until a silent girl appeared at his doorstep, holding a weathered sign that read, "The world never forgives a girl like me." She knew his name. He had never seen her before. What unfolded next was not just a reckoning. It was a quiet miracle. If stories of redemption, love, and second chances speak to your soul, we invite you to subscribe and stay with us. This one, you'll want to hear all the way through. Now let's begin. The wind rustled through the pine trees like an old man clearing his throat, low, persistent, and strangely human. Mercer Clay adjusted the collar of his worn flannel shirt as he guided his mare Junebug through the winding forest path. He wasn't looking for anything in particular, just movement distraction, something to keep him from thinking about how quiet the house had gotten since Owen left for college. Fallen pine needles softened the crunch of Junebug's hooves. The air smelled like sap smoke and something older earth turned over by history. This part of Arizona, nestled between forgotten roads and red soil, had a way of preserving ghosts. Mercer knew that well enough. He'd buried his wife under a cottonwood tree not far from here. Some nights, he still heard her voice in the trees. He'd just passed the old boundary post, splintered and faded, when Junebug stopped dead. Mercer frowned. Easy girl. She didn't move. Then he saw her. At first he thought it was a bundle of cloth someone had tossed beneath the tree. But as he stepped closer, the shape resolved into the curled figure of a young woman, motionless knees drawn to chest back against the trunk of a towering pine. Her long black hair covered half her face, tangled with leaves. One arm hung limply around a wooden plank clutched against her chest. He dropped the reins. "Hey," Mercer called, softly, stepping forward, his boots sinking slightly into damp moss. "You all right?" No answer. He knelt beside her, keeping a respectful distance. Her eyes were closed, but not in sleep. There was a tension in her jaw, in the way her fingers curled around the board, as if it were the last piece of something she couldn't afford to lose. He looked down at the wood and read the words carved in jagged, uneven letters. She was never meant to be forgiven. His stomach clenched. Thunder rolled somewhere behind the hills. The girl's eyes opened. They were dark, bottomless, not frightened, not even angry. Just ancient. As if she'd been waiting for this exact moment, this exact man, for far longer than 19 years could explain. Mercer opened his mouth to speak again, but she beat him to it. Her voice came out hoarse and small like smoke drifting through winter air. "Mercer." He froze. "What did you say?" She didn't repeat it, just stared, his breath caught in his throat. That name, his name spoken by a stranger in the middle of the forest, held a weight he couldn't place. "Do I know you?" he asked quietly. Still no answer. The wind picked up, brushing through the pine branches above them. Somewhere far off, a hawk cried. She finally blinked once, slowly. "Your name," she said, "was the last thing my mother said before she died." He felt like the earth tilted beneath him. For a moment, Mercer couldn't breathe. "What's your name?" he managed to ask. "Ayanna," she whispered. It sounded like wind and water and something sacred. He looked back down at the sign. His mind reeled through memories long buried, the relocation camps, the orders, the silence of obedience. He hadn't touched a weapon. He hadn't raised a hand. But he'd stood there, watched a woman dragged from her shelter with a baby in her arms. He didn't know what happened to them after that. Until now. Jesus, Mercer muttered, rubbing a hand down his face. "What are you doing out here, Ayanna?" She shifted slightly, but her voice stayed even. Waiting. For what? For the man who didn't forgive himself. Her words hit him harder than the wind ever could. They stayed like that in silence, him kneeling on ground, too sacred for his boots, her sitting with a sign too heavy for her arms. Then Mercer stood slowly and extended a hand. "I don't know what this is, or why you're really here," he said, "but it's getting cold. You can stay at my place tonight. I won't ask you anything you're not ready to answer." She didn't move. "I'll leave the door unlocked," he added. "You don't have to trust me. Just don't stay out here alone." He turned and walked back to Junebug, mounted the mare, waited a beat. And then he heard it. Footsteps. Turning his head, he saw her rise, the wooden sign still cradled like a fragile truth. She walked slowly, steadily toward him. No fear, no hesitation. And in her gaze, there was no judgment. Only a mirror. The kettle whistled low and slow, like a distant train pulling away from something familiar. Mercer reached for it, hand wrapped in an old dish towel, and poured the water into 2 chipped mugs. The wood stove creaked behind him, popping with pine resin as it warmed the little cabin. Outside, the wind scratched against the shutters like an unwelcome memory trying to get in. She sat at the table, perfectly still. He had offered her a chair, a blanket, and space. He didn't offer conversation. She hadn't spoken another word since the walk from the woods, not that he expected her to. Mercer placed 1 mug in front of her. Chamomile, his late wife's favorite. The dried petals were old, nearly forgotten in a mason jar on the shelf. Funny how memory finds its way into the present when you least want it. Ayanna glanced at the mug. Her fingers didn't move toward it. "You warm enough?" he asked, voice low, gentle. She gave a small nod. He nodded too awkwardly and sat across from her. They drank in silence. Or, rather, he drank. She held the mug finely as if testing its weight. "You said my name out there," he said after a while. "You knew it before I said a word." Ayanna didn't flinch. She stared at the steam rising from her tea like it held the past in vapor form. Mercer tried again. "You said it was the last thing your mother spoke." Still, she said nothing. He wasn't sure what hurt more, the memory she carried, or the fact that it had finally come back for him. He had worked hard to forget that year, that assignment, that camp. There'd been orders, protests, and silence. So much damn silence. "I don't know what she told you," he said slowly, "but if you came here to hear me say I was innocent, you're in the wrong place." Ayanna looked up finally. Her eyes didn't flash with anger. They carried something else, something colder. Understanding. And that was worse. "I didn't come here for apologies," she said quietly. He blinked. "No, I came to see if someone like you could change." Mercer felt that like a blow. There was no rage in her tone, no heat, just honesty. That kind of truth didn't scream. It whispered, and it left bruises. She took a sip of the tea, then closed her eyes for a moment, as if the warmth took her somewhere better. "I was 7 when my mother died," she said. "I don't remember the exact way she looked anymore. Not really. But I remember the last 3 things she said." He weighted hands resting flat on the table. "She said my name. She said to never forget who I was. And she said, your name." Mercer swallowed hard. I don't expect you to remember her. There were many. And to you, she might have just been someone caught in something you didn't control." He opened his mouth, but no words came. "She wasn't angry when she said it," Ayanna added. "She was tired. Like she'd seen something in you. Something I needed to see too." Mercer stared at her. "I'm not that man anymore." "No," she said. "You're not. That's why I came." She said it like a fact, not a plea, not a threat, just a quiet observation. It rattled him more than yelling ever could. Ayanna reached into her canvas bag, the same one she'd held in the woods, and pulled out a small leather notebook. She slid it across the table. He didn't touch it. "It's not just about you," she said. "That notebook has names, places. What was taken? What was burned?" Mercer looked down at the cover. It was old, cracked at the edges, like it had traveled far and carried weight heavier than its size. "And what do you want me to do with it?" he asked. Ayanna stood slowly. Her voice, when it came, was soft and sharp like wind through broken glass. "Nothing. Just don't pretend you never stood there." She turned to the door. Mercer stood too. "It's dark out." "I know. You can stay. In the back room, it locks from the inside. No one comes up here, but just in case." She hesitated. He could see it in her shoulders. "I'm not afraid," she said. "I am," he replied honestly. They stared at each other for a long moment. Finally, she nodded once and walked toward the back, her footsteps barely a whisper on the old wooden floor. The door clicked shut behind her. Mercer stood in the kitchen for a long time, staring at the notebook. The stove crackled. The wind sighed. Somewhere outside, a coyote called to the hills. He sat down again, picked up the book, and opened it. The first page held a drawing. Charcoal rough but careful. A woman's face, strong jaw, fierce eyes, and a sadness that reached through the paper. He recognized her. He'd only seen her once under the harsh glare of floodlights and orders. He closed the book and laid it gently back on the table. Then, without meaning to, he whispered her name. "Nafordista." The sun rose slowly behind the mountains, reluctant and pale, casting a silvery light through the fog that hung low along the valley. Mercer stood on the front porch with a chipped mug in his hand, steam curling upward like prayer smoke. He hadn't slept. Inside the house it was quiet, too quiet for the weight that now lived in it. He kept replaying her voice in his mind. "Just don't pretend you never stood there." He hadn't. That was the problem. Back then he'd been 20, too young to question orders, too old to pretend he didn't understand what he was watching. He hadn't known the woman's name, just the look in her eyes, like she knew none of them would come back clean. He hadn't spoken. Not to her. Not even to himself. Until now. The door creaked behind him. Mercer turned, expecting silence, but Ayanna stood there in the doorway, wrapped in a heavy flannel coat that hung off her shoulders like borrowed armor. Her hair was pulled back, face washed, calm. She looked like she belonged in the silence, not out of place in it, part of it. "Coffee?" he asked. She nodded, stepping onto the porch. He poured her a cup and handed it over. Their hands didn't touch. They sat side by side in the cold. "Who was she?" Mercer asked after a long pause. Ayanna didn't look at him. Her name was Anna Greyhawk. She was born in the mountains above Oak Creek, raised by her grandmother after the army raids took her parents. She taught herself to speak English by reading roadside billboards and paperback novels. She refused to leave the land. And she was your mother. Ayanna nodded. She told stories about fire, she said. Said fire was how the land remembered pain, but it was also how it healed. Mercer stared out over the valley. She was right. They drank in silence for a while. Then Ayanna said, "I want to see it." He turned. "See what the place, where it happened." Mercer swallowed. His fingers tightened around the mug. "It's nothing now. Just trees. New buildings. Parking lot, maybe. The government pretended it was never there. I know. I want to see it anyway." He wanted to say no. To protect her. To protect himself. But it wasn't about protection. Not anymore. "All right," he said. "We'll go after breakfast." They took the old truck, the one with one working headlight and a glove box full of unpaid warnings. The road twisted down through cottonwood groves and fields dotted with deer tracks. The radio didn't work. The silence suited them. It was nearly noon when Mercer turned down a barely there dirt road, overgrown with weeds and thyme. He pulled over beside a broken gatepost. "This is it," he said. Ayanna stepped out first. The land looked ordinary, which made it worse. A few crumbled cinder blocks lay scattered like bones. A metal barrel rusted into the earth, and trees, young green growing without permission, had taken over the edges. She walked ahead, slow and deliberate, as if listening to the soil. Mercer didn't follow. He couldn't move. Ayanna stopped near a flat patch of earth, where the gravel was blackened. She knelt, ran her fingers through the dirt. Charcoal came up between them. Burned pine. He knew that smell, knew the sound it made under his boots the night the tents were lit. She didn't cry. She stood after a while, turned to face him. "She died right here," she said, holding me. "They tore her away. I ran. I hid under a food truck. I didn't scream. I didn't make a sound." Mercer's throat burned. "I was there," he said. "I didn't try to stop it. I didn't help her. I didn't help you." She didn't respond. He stepped closer. "I was scared," he whispered. "Not of what they'd do to me, of what it meant to see it and do nothing." Ayanna looked down at her hands. "It wasn't just you. The world watched. I can't change what happened." "No," she said, "but you can carry it with truth." She bent down, picked up a smooth stone from the ground, and placed it on the blackened earth. Then another, and another. A small circle began to take shape. Mercer followed her lead. By the time the sun dropped low, they'd built a ring of memory, simple and silent. Not a monument, just a space to say we remember. That night the wind picked up again. The cabin creaked and moaned as old wood does when it tries to hold secrets. Mercer sat by the fireplace, turning over the notebook she'd given him. Inside were not just names, but songs, drawings, family lines, recipes, pages of a culture nearly lost. And in the middle, a letter. It wasn't addressed to anyone, just written in small, precise handwriting. If you find this, know that history does not demand revenge. It demands witness. He closed the notebook and sat back. Above the mantel, an old photograph hung his late wife in a summer dress, hair blowing across her face, caught mid-laugh. She was part Apache. He never talked about that, not even with Owen. Maybe it was time to start. The storm came in quiet. A hush fell over the valley that evening, the kind that makes you glance up from your thoughts, sensing something has shifted. The air felt heavy, pressed down like a hand on the back of your neck. Mercer stood on the porch, watching as clouds gathered over the pines, charcoal gray and slow-moving. He hadn't seen rain in weeks, maybe longer. Inside the cabin, Ayanna was sitting cross-legged on the floor, sketching something in charcoal on a torn piece of cardboard. She didn't look up as thunder groaned in the distance. "You okay in here?" he asked, stepping back inside, brushing pine needles off his sleeves. She nodded, once eyes still fixed on the lines she was drawing. Mercer looked around the room. It had become something different over the past week. The corners didn't echo like they used to. The silence had softened. There were signs of her. Now her blanket folded carefully each morning, her cup turned upside down to dry her presence, subtle but real. He noticed the wood stove needed restocking and moved to the pile near the hearth. "Is that a song?" he asked, nodding toward the markings on the cardboard. "No," she replied. "A map. To wear memory." Mercer tilted his head. "You always speak in riddles, only when the truth's too heavy to name." He chuckled softly, not unkindly. Fair enough. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the cabin in a wash of silver. Ayanna looked up at the window, her body suddenly tense. "I don't like storms," she said. The words came out tight, as if pushed past a wall inside her. Mercer paused. "Bad memory." She didn't answer. Instead, she stood and walked toward the small room in the back, the one he'd offered her the first night. Before she disappeared behind the door, she turned slightly. "Do you have candles?" He nodded. "In the drawer near the stove." She grabbed two and closed the door behind her. The wind picked up around midnight. The rain came harder, sheets of water pounding the metal roof like fists full of nails. Mercer lay awake on the couch, one arm over his forehead, listening for the creak of floorboards or the soft pad of her footsteps. But the house stayed silent. Then came the smell, sharp and unmistakable. Smoke. He bolted upright. A faint orange glow pulsed from under the door to the back room. He rushed forward, flung it open. Ayanna was standing in the middle of the room, staring at the far wall, where flames had begun crawling up the curtain, licking toward the wooden beams above. Her candle had tipped, igniting the fabric. She didn't move. She just stood there, paralyzed. Ayanna Mercer shouted. She didn't flinch. Without thinking, he grabbed the wool blanket from the cot and threw it over the fire. It sizzled and smoked the scent of burning cloth, filling the room. He beat the flames down until nothing but steam and scorched fabric remained. Only then did he turn to her. She was shaking. Not from heat, not from fear of fire, from something deeper. He reached out slowly, hands raised. "You're okay. It's out. You're safe." She looked up at him, eyes glassy. "I didn't mean to," she started, but her voice caught. "I know." Silence thickened around them. "I couldn't move," she whispered. "It was like I was 5 again. The night they came, I smelled smoke, and I was back under that truck, listening to them scream. I thought I could stand the memory, but I can't. Not when it's real." Mercer stood still. She stepped back, breathing fast, holding herself like she was trying not to shatter. "I shouldn't be here," she said. "This place, it's too close to everything I've tried to forget." Mercer felt something pull tight in his chest. "You don't have to forget it," he said gently. "You just have to survive it." She looked at him, expression unreadable. Then, after a long moment, she turned away. "I'm sorry." He didn't stop her as she slipped out of the room, grabbed her satchel, and stepped out into the storm. He found her an hour later. The rain had lessened to a whisper, just enough to blur the stars. She was sitting under the cottonwood tree behind the barn, soaked through her arms wrapped around her knees. The sign, "The past doesn't forget," rested beside her like a gravestone. Mercer didn't speak. He sat beside her close enough to be there, far enough not to intrude. "You shouldn't have followed me," she said. "I didn't," he replied. "I just didn't want you to be alone." She gave a short, bitter laugh. "I've been alone longer than you've been sorry." "That's probably true." She turned to him. "Why do you keep trying?" she asked. "Do you really think you can make up for it?" He didn't answer right away. The night needed space to breathe. "No," he said finally. "But I think I can stop pretending it didn't matter." Ayanna looked at him for a long time. Then softly she whispered, "That fire didn't burn the house down." "No, but it could have." He nodded. They sat in silence after that. And somewhere between the drops of rain, the memory of fire and the weight of all they couldn't change, something in the night began to shift. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But the start of something that just might hold its shape in the morning. The next morning dawned quiet, but not in a peaceful way. It was the kind of silence Mercer had known in burn zones, after the fire, when nothing moved, and the air still remembered what it had just lost. Ash settled in the bones of the trees, and birds forgot how to sing. He brewed coffee out of habit more than desire. The worn enamel pot hissed on the stovetop, filling the cabin with its bitter aroma. Across the room, the cot in the back was empty, the blanket neatly folded. The door left ajar. Ayanna hadn't come back in after the storm. Mercer walked out barefoot, the grass wet and cool underfoot. He found her seated again under the cottonwood, her back straight hair still damp, hands resting calmly in her lap, like someone waiting for judgment. He didn't speak, just handed her the mug and sat beside her. She took it quietly, sipped once eyes focused on a distant point in the hills. Finally, she spoke. I wasn't planning to stay long, just long enough to see if what she said about you was true. Mercer kept his eyes forward. What did she say? That you weren't like the others. That when they dragged her away, you looked down, and then looked back at her. I did. Well, because I was ashamed. Ayanna turned to him, voice even. She said you were afraid, but not of them, of yourself. Mercer rubbed his palms together. Your mother saw more in me than I deserved. She did that with everyone. It was her curse. There was no bitterness in Ayanna's tone, only a quiet ache, as if she'd spent years trying not to carry her mother's hope and failing. Mercer nodded slowly. What else did she say? Ayanna reached into the satchel at her side. This time, it wasn't the notebook she pulled out, but a folded document worn at the creases edges darkened by age. She handed it to him. It was a military relocation, manifest, a list of names, dates assigned, personnel, destinations. Mercer scanned it with a dry mouth. They're printed in neat block letters next to Transport 6. Fire Valley Camp Evacuation was his name. You kept this? He asked. Ayanna didn't answer. Instead, she pulled out another paper, a declassified summary from a Bureau of Indigenous Affairs file. Another, a sketch of the camp layout. Another, a photograph blurred and grainy showing tents half collapsed and soldiers silhouetted in floodlights. Mercer stared at the pile. Where did you get all this? I've been looking for you since I was 16, she said. There was no justice, no inquiries, no names ever spoken out loud. I wanted to know if the man who watched my mother disappear would disappear too. He felt the air drain from his lungs. You think I came here to hide? You did. And what do you want? Now, he asked. An apology. A confession. No, she said, voice low. I want you to help me remember. Help the world remember. Not just her, but the others. The ones no one talks about. Mercer let the documents fall onto his lap. I'm not a historian, Ayanna. I'm not a hero. I put out fires and fix fences. That's all I'm good for now. You were there. That's enough. Her words weren't angry. They were absolute. She rose and walked back toward the cabin, leaving him with a lap full of paper and a heart weighed down by truth. That afternoon, Mercer sat at the kitchen table, the notebook open beside a stack of dusty photo albums. He hadn't touched them in years, not since Ellen passed. Flipping through the pages, he paused on one, a photo of his late wife on their wedding day, laughing under a tree, the Arizona sun turning her skin golden. Behind her, faint but visible, was a woman in a woven headscarf, standing near the edge of the crowd. Anna. Mercer leaned in. His chest tightened. He hadn't remembered her being there. How many times had she stood on the edge of things, quietly witnessing? He turned the page and froze. There, tucked between the leaves, was a faded postcard, one he didn't recall ever receiving. On the back, in a looping script, read, "You don't have to fix it, but don't let it disappear." There was no signature. Mercer sat back, the chair creaking beneath him. The world was folding in ways he hadn't prepared for. That evening, he found Ayanna by the barn, sorting tools into neat rows. Her movements were methodical, almost meditative. He held the postcard out to her. She read it, paused, then looked at him with something new in her eyes, recognition perhaps, or weariness finally giving way to trust. "She mailed it to my wife," Mercer said. "I think Ellen kept it there for me to find when I was ready." Ayanna's gaze softened. "Your wife, she was part Apache." "She never talked about it. I think she carried it like a quiet vow, not to speak until someone listened. Ayanna handed back the card. Then maybe we both waited long enough. Mercer looked around the barn at the empty shelves and the old workbench. I think I can make this a place for stories, he said. Not big, just enough room for the truth to stretch its legs. Ayanna nodded. That's all it ever needed. The sun slipped behind the hills, turning the valley gold. For the first time in a long time, Mercer didn't feel buried in the past. He felt rooted. Ayanna didn't smile, but her voice carried warmth. You're not who you were, she said. No, he answered. But maybe I can be the man she thought I was. It began with bread. Mercer wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the way the air had changed, less heavy, less watching. Or maybe it was the look on Ayanna's face the night before, after she read the postcard, and didn't look away. He pulled out the old mixing bowl the next morning, the one Ellen used to leave on the windowsill to catch sun. The flour was clumpy, the yeast almost expired, but it would do. His hands remembered the motions, even if his heart hadn't done this in years. He found Ayanna already outside raking fallen leaves into a tidy pile beside the barn. She moved like someone who had learned discipline, early back straight eyes, down movements, efficient, but never hurried. There was no music in her work, just necessity. You ever make bread? He asked, walking up with flour still dusted on his hands. She paused, turned. No, she said. Want to learn. There was a moment just long enough to be uncertain. Then she nodded. They worked in silence, hands in dough, shoulders, sometimes bumping by accident. The kitchen filled with the smell of something more than food. Something warm and rooted and old, like memory softened by time. When the dough rose, they sat on the porch again this time, not as strangers. Ellen used to bake every Friday, Mercer said the smell made the house feel alive. She sounds like someone who understood roots, Ayanna replied. She did, he said, smiling faintly. She could plant anything, even in dust. Ayanna picked at the seam of her jeans. My mother didn't bake, but she could make fry bread over open fire thin as paper, tough as history. Mercer chuckled. Sounds about right. The bread came out a little too dense, a little too brown on the bottom. But when they sat down to eat, it didn't matter. They tore it with their hands, dipped it in honey, and let the warmth fill the spaces between words. That afternoon, Ayanna suggested cleaning out the barn. It had been half storage, half tomb since Ellen passed full of broken tools, rusted bolts, and forgotten intentions. Let's make it usable, she said. For the stories. Mercer didn't argue. They worked side by side for hours. Ayanna swept, Mercer sorted. Dust clouded around them, settling in their hair on their clothes, but neither seemed to mind. Occasionally, Mercer would hold up some relic, an old lantern, a busted boot, and Ayanna would raise an eyebrow or offer a dry comment. You keep everything, she asked at one point, holding up a cracked ceramic rooster. Mercer shrugged. That was Ellen's. Said it was good luck. Never laid a single egg, though. Ayanna actually smiled, just a flicker, but real. By dusk, they had cleared enough space to see the floorboards. Mercer found an old workbench beneath a tarp and began dusting it off. Ayanna pulled a chair from the corner and sat down with the notebook. They didn't speak for a long while. It was a silence Mercer had come to recognize, not avoidance, not discomfort. Just the kind of stillness that came when two people were finally safe enough to not need words. As the light faded, Ayanna looked up. You said something yesterday, she said. That you weren't a hero. I meant it. She shook her head. Maybe that's why you're starting to become one. Mercer blinked. That's not how it works, isn't it? He leaned against the workbench, arms crossed, staring out at the last streak of sun burning through the barn's open door. Heroes don't have pasts like mine, he said. Ayanna closed the notebook gently. Maybe they do. They just don't stay in them. She stood, walked to the doorway, and turned back. "I'll write a song," she said, "about the woman who carried memory and the man who finally turned around." Then she disappeared into the fading light. Later that night, Mercer found himself standing in the barn alone. He lit an old oil lamp, its glow soft and forgiving. On the newly cleared bench sat the postcard again. "You don't have to fix it, but don't let it disappear." He ran a finger over the edges, then opened the drawer below. Inside was a tattered folder marked Camp 47 Personnel Roster. He'd kept it all these years, not out of guilt, but as a kind of penance. Proof that he hadn't forgotten. Proof he had once belonged to something he now wanted to undo. Mercer stared at it, then slowly laid the folder beside the notebook. He was ready to remember. But more than that, he was ready to be useful. That night, long after the oil lamp flickered out, Mercer sat alone in the kitchen staring at his hands, dusty, calloused flour still caught beneath his nails. Hands that had once saluted orders, now building something else. The silence in the house had changed again. Not haunted, not heavy, just whole. The first notes came just after midnight, soft, barely audible, like a breeze slipping through the cracks in an old door. Mercer was dozing on the couch, a book half open on his chest, when the melody floated through the cabin so delicate he thought at first it was the wind. But then it repeated, not in gusts, but in rhythm. Human. Steady. Intentional. He sat up, heart suddenly aware of itself. The sound was coming from the barn. He rose quietly, pulling on his boots and an old wool jacket. Outside, the sky was blanketed in stars. The earth beneath his feet felt cool and clean, rinsed by the recent storm and calmed by the stillness of late autumn. The barn door was slightly ajar. Inside, the oil lamp burned low, casting golden light across the dust-danced air. And in the center, cross-legged on the freshly swept floor, sat Ayanna. She held a hand-carved flute, weathered simple, wrapped in a strip of red cloth. Her eyes were closed. The melody that slipped from the instrument wasn't polished or ornamental. It was true. Raw in a way that felt ancient. A song not for performance, but for remembering. Mercer didn't move, didn't speak. He stood in the doorway as if afraid his presence might startle the moment back into silence. The song rose and fell like breath, 4 notes, then 5. A pause. Then a return to the first, as if circling something that could not be approached directly. It sounded like longing. It sounded like water trying to climb uphill. And then suddenly, it stopped. Ayanna opened her eyes slowly, and for a long moment she simply stared at the flute in her lap. "I haven't played that since she died," she said. Mercer took a step inside. It was beautiful. She shook her head gently. It wasn't meant to be. It was meant to remember. She ran a finger along the edge of the flute. "My mother carved it. Out of cottonwood. Said music was the one thing they couldn't burn. Not if you carried it in your chest." Mercer sat down on a hay bale across from her. That song, it had weight. "She used to play it while making fry bread," Ayanna said softly. "Every time the fire flared up too high, she'd add a new note. Said the flame needed a voice." They sat for a while in the quiet, the oil lamp flickering between them like a living thing. "I've been trying to remember her laugh," Ayanna said almost to herself. "I remember her anger, her grief, even her silence. But the sound of her laugh, it's fading." Mercer leaned forward. "What was she like when it was just the two of you?" Ayanna tilted her head back, fierce and soft, like desert rain. She'd sing to the trees when we walked like they were listening, and she always looked people in the eye, even when they didn't want her to. Sounds like someone I would have been lucky to meet. You did. Mercer swallowed. Then I was too blind to see her. Ayanna didn't correct him. Instead, she held up the flute. She told me, she said, that one day I'd need to play this song for someone who had forgotten the sound of their own name. Mercer frowned. And you think that's me? She nodded once. Not your name in the world, your name in the heart. Those words settled deep in him like coals buried in ash. I don't know if I'm ready to remember that name, he said. Then I'll keep playing, she replied, until you are. The next morning, Mercer found her sitting on the back porch, the flute resting in her lap, sunlight warming her face. She wasn't playing, just holding it like a memory that had decided to stay. I've been thinking, he said, setting a mug beside her, about the center, what it could be. Ayanna looked over. Not just a place for stories, he continued, a place to teach, music, language, crafts, food, a space for memory that breathes, not a museum, a living thing. Ayanna considered it. Would they come? They will if you're the one who tells them it matters. She didn't smile, but he saw the lift in her shoulders, the way her fingers drummed lightly on the wood of the flute. I'm not used to being the one who gets to teach, she said. Maybe it's time you were. She nodded, then looked out over the hills. We'll need help. I've got old friends in town, retired teachers, musicians, a few stubborn ranchers who still believe in handshakes. I think they'll listen. And if they don't, Mercer grinned. Then we'll keep playing the song. She chuckled, a real sound, warm and soft, and almost surprised at itself. He looked over, and for the first time, she didn't look like someone carrying loss. She looked like someone shaping something new from it. You know, she said quietly. There was one line in the song I never understood, until last night. What was it? Her eyes met his. The fire doesn't steal everything. It just reveals what was built to survive. That night after dinner, Mercer found a scrap of paper pinned to the wall of the barn. Written in Ayanna's steady hand was the first stanza of the song. He read it aloud, the words, simple, broken, beautiful. Where ash once covered the floor, a flower waits in the dust, not because it forgot the fire, but because it forgave the flame. And in that moment, Mercer Clay finally understood. Some songs are not meant to be sung perfectly. They are meant to be heard. The morning light came golden and still, as if the world itself had chosen to hold its breath. Mercer stood by the barn doorway, arms crossed, watching as Ayanna chalked a circle on the wooden floor. It was a teaching circle she had explained the night before, an Apache tradition used to share knowledge stories medicine. Each direction meant something. Each line had a purpose. You sure this is how you want to start? He asked. Ayanna knelt, brushing sawdust from the final arc. It's not about starting. It's about remembering. She stood and stepped back, nodding slightly in approval at the shape. Her boots scuffed just enough to show she'd walked through years before this. Mercer admired her quiet sense of certainty. It wasn't stubbornness, it was something older, like she was made of roots instead of blood. Circle looks good, he said. Ayanna didn't answer at first. Then, turning to face him, she spoke with a tone softer than usual. This is where my mother used to sit. She said truth never stood on its own. It needed space, shape, room to rest. Mercer nodded. Sounds like your mother was wiser than most. She was alone most of her life. That teaches you things fast. They worked in tandem the rest of the morning, preparing the space, sanding a bench, stringing old blankets to cover the back wall. It was slow work, but healing had always been slower than harm. Inside the cabin on the mantel above the hearth sat the old wooden sign. The past doesn't forget. It hadn't moved since Ayanna first laid it there, but something about it looked different now, not because the words had faded, but because they hadn't. They remained exactly as they were, but the way Mercer saw them had changed. That afternoon, as the sun dipped low and cast amber light into the barn, Mercer returned to the house alone. He stood at the mantel for a long time, hands resting on either side of the sign. He didn't touch it. Didn't need to. Behind him, he heard the door creak. "I used to think the sign was a warning," Ayanna said quietly. Mercer turned. "But now I think it was a question," she continued. "And you've been answering it piece by piece." He exhaled slowly. "I've spent half my life running from that question. And the other half," he looked at her, "trying not to be a man my son would be ashamed of." She nodded. "Then maybe it's time you let the sign go." He hesitated, then walked to the barn and gently placed the sign on the teaching circle, its edges now wrapped in cloth, softening its harsh silhouette. They sat opposite each other in the circle, neither speaking. The silence stretched, not awkward, but necessary. Finally, Mercer said, "There's something I haven't told you." Ayanna raised an eyebrow. "I left the army 2 months after that night. No ceremony, no letters. I just couldn't stand in a uniform anymore." She watched him, not interrupting. "I didn't leave because I was noble," he added. "I left because I was scared. I couldn't trust what I might become if I stayed. And I didn't want to explain to Owen when he grew up why his father stood still when he should have moved." Ayanna's eyes softened. Mercer continued. "Ellen knew. She always knew. She didn't push. But she left pieces, book songs, that old postcard, quiet reminders that someday I'd have to look back. And now you have." He nodded. "And I'm still standing." Ayanna reached into her coat and pulled out something wrapped in cloth. She placed it between them on the floor. It was a stone. Smooth, dark, engraved with a single word. "Anna." "My mother's name," she said. "This was placed at the base of a tree outside the camp. I think someone, maybe a nurse or another worker, marked her name when no one else would." Mercer touched the stone gently. "May I?" Ayanna nodded. He stood, walked to the hearth inside the house, and set the stone next to Ellen's photograph. For a moment, the light caught both faces. Ellen's in the photo, Anna's in the memory, and they seemed to belong together. He turned to Ayanna. "You can leave it here as long as you like." She nodded, then said something he wasn't expecting. "I'm not going to stay." Mercer's breath caught. "I have to go back to the tribal lands," she said, "to bring back others. Elders artists, the young ones who've never even heard their own songs." Mercer tried to steady his voice. "You think they'll come? I think they will," she replied. "But only if this place still stands when they do." He nodded. "It will." She moved toward the door, but paused. "Before I leave tomorrow, there's one more thing we need to do." "What's that?" Her eyes, lit by the fading sun, held something between sorrow and peace. "Rewrite the sign." That night, they sat at the kitchen table together. The old wooden plank lay between them, its surface sanded smooth. Mercer held a carving tool in his hand. Ayanna leaned over and penciled the new words slowly, carefully, letting each one settle before writing the next. Some men don't, but some do. When they were finished, they placed the sign on the mantel where the old one had been. It caught the firelight gently, its message no less honest, but filled with possibility. For the first time, Mercer didn't look away from it. The knock came just after noon. Not loud, just 3 precise raps on the weathered front door, firm, official. The kind of sound that didn't ask to be welcomed. It assumed it had a right to enter. Mercer stood from the kitchen table, brushing flour from his hands. He and Ayanna had spent the morning making fry bread from her mother's old recipe, which neither of them got quite right. The air still smelled like scorched oil, and something warm enough to make a house feel lived in. He opened the door slowly. 2 men stood on the porch, one in a crisp beige uniform with a county badge, the other in plain clothes, but with the stance of someone who'd grown up reading rule books instead of novels. "Mr. Clay," the deputy asked. Mercer nodded. "That's me." "We're with the County Records Office and Tribal Affairs Division," the plainclothes man said. "May we come in?" Mercer didn't move aside. "What's this about?" The deputy shifted. "We've received an inquiry regarding a young woman staying on your property. Apache descent. No current tribal registration or residency permit on file. We're following up." Mercer's stomach clenched. "She's not causing trouble. She's a guest. No laws broken. She's not registered under any existing tribal affiliation. No fixed address," the other man said. "That's grounds for detainment under Title 12 Residency Code." Mercer narrowed his eyes. "She's not a fugitive." "No, sir," the man replied. "But she's an unsupervised adult without proof of citizenship status. That creates liability. Liability for whom Mercer asked, voice tightening, for anyone harboring her." Behind him, Ayanna appeared in the hallway, calm as sunrise. She stepped forward without hesitation. "I'm not hiding," she said evenly. "You can stop pretending I am." The 2 men blinked, momentarily caught off guard by her composure. "I'm a citizen," she continued. "I was born in Holbrook. I have tribal heritage through my mother, Anna Greyhawk. She's not listed in your systems because she died during an undocumented relocation." The deputy glanced at his clipboard, unsure. "I have a copy of my birth certificate," she added, her voice unwavering. "It's in my bag. And I'm not going anywhere with anyone until you show me probable cause." Mercer watched them both carefully. He had never been prouder and never more afraid. The plainclothes officer cleared his throat. "We're not here to remove anyone, just asking questions." "Then you've asked," Ayanna said. "And I've answered." The 2 men exchanged a glance. The younger one hesitated. "You planning to stay long-term on this property?" "That's my choice," she said. Mercer stepped in. "And it's my property. My choice, too." The deputy shifted again. "We'll report that back. You may be hearing from county compliance about zoning use. Educational gatherings require permits." Ayanna smiled faintly. "They'll get my paperwork with the first lesson plan." The men stood there a moment longer, as if hoping the wind might shift the moment in their favor. It didn't. Eventually, the plainclothes man gave a tight nod. "You'll hear from us." Mercer closed the door before they could add anything else. He stood there for a long time, back against the door. "You okay?" he asked without turning. "Yes," she said. "But I wasn't sure I would be." He turned to her. "You didn't flinch. I've been running from men like them for years. It was time to stop." Mercer walked back into the kitchen, poured 2 cups of lukewarm coffee, and handed her one. They sat in the silence of a house that had just refused to be afraid. "You know this might not be over," he said. "I know," she replied. "They'll poke around, ask questions, try to make things harder than they need to be. I've had harder." Mercer looked at her. "You don't have to carry this alone." She met his gaze. "Neither do you." That night, Mercer called an old friend, Marvin Tate, a retired music teacher turned community organizer who'd marched in more protests than most men had attended birthdays. Within minutes, Marvin agreed to come by the next day and walk the perimeter with his smile. By the time Mercer hung up, Ayanna was already writing names down in her notebook. People she wanted to invite, stories that needed space, voices too long silenced. "We'll need benches," she said, "and lights, blankets for the kids, a good speaker system." Mercer laughed. "You're not building a classroom, you're building a revolution." She looked up from her notes. "No," she said. I'm building a place where truth doesn't have to be quiet anymore. The next morning, 2 neighborhood kids wandered up the gravel path, curious about the music they'd heard the day before. One had a ukulele with only 3 strings. The other carried a spiral notebook full of songs she had written, but never shared. Ayanna knelt to greet them like they were already part of the circle. She offered them fry bread and a seat. Mercer stood back, arms crossed, a quiet smile tugging at his face. The visitors would come, some friendly, some not. But the door was open. The barn was ready. And Truth finally had a place to sit down and stay a while. It started with 1 shovel in dry earth. Mercer pushed the blade down with his boot, sweat dampening his collar, the late spring sun blazing overhead. The soil here was stubborn, baked, hard, cracked in places like it didn't trust new roots. But he worked slow, steady, respectful. He wasn't here to take, he was here to give something back. Beside him, Ayanna knelt with a bundle of tiny seedlings, wrapped in damp burlap yarrow sage and desert marigold. Hardy plants chosen carefully. Wildflowers belong here, she'd said. They come back even after fire. She dug with her bare hands, fingers moving through soil, with a kind of sacred attention. Not haste ritual. Each motion a quiet apology to the land, each planting a vow. They used to grow along the path to the old camp, she added, before the fire took everything but the dust. Mercer nodded, pressing the roots into place. Then we'll grow them here. For what was lost, for what still might return. The community had begun to trickle in. First it was Marvin Tate and his guitar wheezing from the back of an old pickup. Then came Diana Reyes from the reservation school, bringing paints, beads, and a bag of stories she said needed air. Soon after, a retired woodworker arrived with his granddaughter, who never spoke, but carried a journal full of drawings Mercer swore he could hear just by looking. They came curious, cautious, then committed. Each brought something that couldn't be measured: memory, music, scar tissue, second chances. And each left something behind a rock painted with a grandmother's name, a verse scrawled on parchment, a tin whistle carved with the name Hope. Inside the barn, the teaching circle was no longer empty. Blankets formed its border. A small table sat in the center, draped with cloth holding feathers. Stones, handwritten poems, a photo of Anna Greyhawk, and the new wooden sign, "Some men don't. But some do." Mercer passed by it each morning like a compass. One afternoon he found Ayanna by the fire pit, weaving dried willow branches into a low fence around the flower beds. "You ever think this would happen?" he asked. She paused, pushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "No. But I hoped." He crouched beside her. "It feels like something's shifting, not just here. In me." She looked over. "That's the thing about truth. It doesn't break you. It undoes what was never meant to last." He nodded. "I thought shame was the only honest thing I had left. But now—" "It's still honest," she said. "But now it's not all you are." There was a long silence between them, comfortable, deep. Then she added, "I think Ellen would have liked this place." Mercer's breath caught slightly. She would have run the whole thing before I even knew what to call it. They shared a quiet smile. No ghosts in it, just gratitude. That evening, the first music circle took place. They'd set up string lights along the rafters of the barn donated from a nearby cafe, and arranged cushions and hay bales for seating. Ayanna played first. Not the flute this time, but a frame drum, her voice low and rhythmic, like the sound of footsteps returning home. She sang of women who walked through flame, of sons who carried names not theirs, of hands that planted truth in dust, of men who dared to care. No one spoke when she finished. Some cried, some clapped softly. Then Marvin played. Then a child with a ukulele. Then a mother reading her late husband's poem. Mercer didn't play. He listened. He sat in the back, arms, crossed eyes, misted heart open in a way it hadn't been in years. He realized something then. He didn't need to lead this. He just needed to keep the door open. Days passed like prayers, each one planting something new. One morning, Mercer found 4 kids crouched beside the wildflowers, whispering. He asked what they were doing. Listening, one girl said. To what? The roots. He chuckled, but the answer stayed with him. That evening, he and Ayanna added the final touch to the teaching circle, a small plaque carved from mesquite wood. This place was not built to forget. It was built so memory could grow wild and truth could rest. Ayanna stared at the words for a long time. Then quietly she said, "My mother would have liked that." "She's part of it now," Mercer replied. On the last day of spring, they hosted their first full circle. Over 24 people sat in the barn, old, young, native white, unsure, hopeful. They shared bread. They painted stones. They told stories without asking permission first. At the end, Mercer stood up slowly, humbly, and said, "This place was born from silence, but now it sings. Thank you for listening." As the sun set, Ayanna stepped out to the flower beds and knelt beside the first marigold to bloom. She pressed her fingers into the red soil. Mercer stood beside her. "We didn't fix it all," he said. She looked up. "No," she replied. "But we made room for something better." He reached down, helped her to her feet. And as they stood there beneath the stars, beside the wildflowers surrounded by all they had risked to grow, it became clear. Sometimes redemption doesn't come as a thunderclap. Sometimes it blooms. The morning of the dedication was still and golden, the kind of morning where even the birds seemed to sing with intention. Mercer stood by the barn, smoothing the front of his only clean button-down shirt, fingers still calloused from the week's work. Around him, the yard buzzed gently, neighbors arriving, folding chairs being set up, coffee being poured from mismatched thermoses into paper cups. They had come, more than he expected, maybe more than he deserved. And they weren't here out of curiosity. They were here because something had begun, and they had felt it. Inside the barn, the circle waited. So did Ayanna. She was by the back wall, standing in front of the new wooden sign they had carved together 3 nights before, hand over hand, chisel and ink, word by word. She had sanded the surface smooth, then burned the letters into it herself. Mercer joined her silently, both of them staring at what now hung above the mantel in the barn's center. This land remembers, so do we. No names, no blame, just presence, just truth. Ayanna looked at him, eyes bright but steady. "You ready?" she asked. "No," Mercer admitted. "But that hasn't stopped me yet." They smiled. And then they stepped out into the circle of chairs as the crowd quieted. Marvin was already at the front, guitar in hand. He nodded at Mercer, who gave him a grateful glance, but didn't step forward yet. Instead, he turned to Ayanna. She took a breath and spoke, not loud, not commanding, but with a stillness that carried further than any shout. "My mother's name was Anna Greyhawk," she said. "She died without a gravestone, without a story told. For years I carried that silence like a weight, but silence is only sacred when it's chosen." She let the words settle. "This place is for all the things that were taken, and all the things we're taking back, not with fists, not with fire, with remembering, with planting, with singing, with staying." She paused, glanced at Mercer, then added, "And with forgiveness, not the kind you ask for, but the kind you grow into." She stepped back. Now it was Mercer's turn. He moved forward, slowly cleared his throat. "I was a man who stood still when he should have moved," he began. "I was taught that silence was safer than truth. That distance was cleaner than regret. He looked down for a moment, then back at the gathered faces. But then a girl came to my door, holding a sign. And instead of turning away, I listened, and she gave me something I thought I'd lost a place to begin again. His voice grew quiet. We built this together, not to erase the past, but to walk with it, so it wouldn't walk alone anymore. He turned toward the barn, gesturing to the entrance. So today this place becomes more than a memory. It becomes a promise. There was no applause, only stillness. The kind of stillness that comes before something sacred. After the words were spoken, people moved inside the barn in pairs and threes. Some wept. Some knelt by the teaching circle and placed stones, photos, words. One boy placed a single shoelace, saying it was the only thing he had left of his brother. Ayanna didn't ask why. She just nodded and held his hand. Mercer stood by the sign as people filed past, watching them not as a guardian, but as a witness. Eventually, the crowd thinned. Twilight draped itself over the valley in a hush of gold and lilac. The last car pulled away, leaving only dust and tire tracks, and the echo of stories newly spoken. That evening the barn was quiet again. Just Mercer, Ayanna, and the wildflowers outside nodding in the dusk. They sat side by side on the back steps, sharing the last of the lemonade, watching stars blink into being. "You still leaving tomorrow?" he asked. She nodded. "Just for a while." "I need to bring others back. You'll return." She looked at him, something warm in her expression. "This place isn't just a shelter anymore, Mercer. It's home. I'll always return to that." He nodded, then hesitated. "There's something I want to say," he said, voice low. "And I'm not asking for anything in return." She turned to face him. "I forgive you," he said. She blinked, not expecting that. "Not for what you did," he added, "but for what you carried because of it. You've been shouldering everyone's forgetting for so long, you forgot you were more than the memory." Ayanna's eyes glistened, not with sorrow, but something else. Release. She leaned her head against his shoulder quietly. "Thank you," she whispered. They sat like that a long time, no words needed, just the sound of crickets and the wind moving through wildflowers. Sometime past midnight, Mercer stepped back into the barn one last time. The sign caught his eye again. "This land remembers. So do we." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a worn name tag. His old military ID faded and scratched. He placed it on the altar beside Anna's stone. Then he turned off the lamp and walked out into the night. Some stories don't end with answers. They end with a door left open, a light left on, and the quiet hope that someone somewhere will find their way home. If this story touched something in you, we'd love to hear from you. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. It means more than you know. And if you'd like to walk alongside us for more stories like this, of kindness, redemption, and second chances, feel free to subscribe. No pressure, just an open invitation. Thank you truly for spending your time with us today. Wherever you are, may peace find you gently.